I feel like we had a pretty good streak going of actually starting the show on time. I apologize 2 days in a row, a little late, but we're glad you're with us nonetheless. My name's Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. A fun show for us coming up. We're lucky to have Jeff Sentell here. As Georgia heads towards a big recruiting weekend, we'll find out from Jeff, indeed, what UGA has planned and the big prospects that could be swayed by that visit. I know Jeff will have some great things to say about that. There's also some news items out there, the D'Angelo Gibbs stuff. We'll get into that. I thought Chip Towers did a great piece at DawgNation.com by Brian Harry, and I want to talk about that a little bit today, too. So it's going to be a pretty packed show here for a Friday. And I guess off the top, we also have to deal with something that Jeff Sentell said when he joined us on Tuesday, the fact that Georgia might be in some trouble if it didn't have its defensive backs coach in place for this big upcoming recruiting weekend. Well, as it stands right now on a Friday morning, that hasn't happened at least yet. So we'll talk about what it all means as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I grew up obsessed with the media, right? When I was a kid, I could not stop watching TV, reading newspapers, listening to radio. That was always my thing. And then when I got to high school age, I became really, really into cable news and the glory days of these big cable news networks getting established, and they were all trying to one up each other with the more sensational content, the better. I guess in a way things really haven't changed all that much. But this was back when that stuff was first getting started. One of the things I always loved was either the countdown clock or in this case, I guess it'd be a count ahead clock, because I was actually kind of thinking about that. If we really wanted to sensationalize what's going on around Georgia right now, the thing that we should do, at least for the video audience, is have the clock of how many days it's been since Georgia has been without a defensive coordinator and without a defensive backs coach, as it counts 60 days. 61 days and 5 hours and 32 minutes and on and on and on, because I really do feel that's kind of the mood of dog fans here. They're excited about recruiting. They're interested in kind of getting ready for the 2019 season, but they want to put a lid on this coaching staff. They want to get this done, especially with a big recruiting weekend coming up this Friday, Saturday, Sunday there in Athens, as some big name recruits are expected to be at UGA. More with Jeff Sentell on that in a moment. And I guess I don't want to sensationalize the lack of defensive backs coach too much. Georgia may still hire a great coach. Nor do I want to sensationalize the defensive coordinator situation too much either. I think the guy for that job, one way or another, is already in-house, and I think at some point in time that'll be announced. The defensive backs coach will be hired, and maybe there's a chance it's still going to be one of these, even if it's not one of the big names we've heard talked about, it's still a big name that makes Georgia fans happy. I would never sit here and tell you that you ought to be worried, but I do feel given what has been said on DawgNation Daily this week, we've at least got to acknowledge what's still not done compared to at the beginning of the week, what some people were saying needed to be done. I'll give you an example of that. We'll ask Jeff Sentell about this when he joins us in a little bit, but when he was here on Tuesday, he said in terms of that coaching situation that as you head towards the weekend, he kind of put that as a deadline, as a time that you needed to have something done, needed to have something in place. Just to kind of be fair and balanced here is what Jeff said on this subject on Tuesday about what would happen by the weekend if there was no defensive backs coach in place when guys like Elam are expected to be in Athens. Here's Jeff Sentell.
I think it becomes a big deal if we get to Friday and some official visitors start trickling in where Georgia doesn't have the defensive coordinator settled, and especially maybe the defensive backs coach settled. Elam, let's face it, definitely likely the number one remaining target in the to-do list in the class hierarchy for 2019. He's expected to make his official visit to Georgia this weekend. That comes off the heels of the Florida official visit he just took. Florida and Georgia are the alpha contenders for Elam, to say the least.
So, listen, we'll talk more to Jeff Sentell about that in a minute when he's with us here live. But on Tuesday, he said it's a Georgia versus Florida battle for Elam, big-time defensive back, the kind of player that Georgia needs to match up with the collection of wide receivers that Alabama has in an SEC championship game. You need players like Elam. You got to beat out Florida for him, which apparently did a pretty good job of hosting him last weekend. And Jeff says on Friday it's going to be a big deal if there's no defensive backs coach in place. And as of right now, there's not. So do with that what you will, I guess. In terms of this hire coming sometime here today, there's reason to wonder if that's even going to be possible given how busy Kirby Smart's been as of late. If you're watching on video, I'll show this to you. If you were following me on Twitter last night, I also going to tweet this out. Kirby Smart at Lake Wales football down in the state of Florida yesterday, landing with his helicopter and, being out and about. We've seen that Kirby chopper, the Kirby copter, as people like to call it. We've seen it flying around a lot lately. He's been out and about recruiting. Now, obviously, this is a guy that burns the candle at both ends. Maybe he's talking to defensive backs coaches late at night. But right now, at least during the daytime hours, the typical working hours, Kirby's been pretty busy meeting with recruits, visiting high schools. And from that standpoint, you wonder, how much time has he had to kind of go out there and hire a defensive backs coach? Was another reason for some Georgia fans. There's a little bit of anxiousness, a little bit of nervousness. Now, I thought that Mike Griffith was important on Wednesday when he said that he doesn't think that Georgia fans should be worried about this at all. He thinks it's all going to be settled and taken care of. It's all going to fall into place. And I guess it's also as a way of kind of explaining why this has already worked out for Georgia. And we'll go back to Tyreek Stevenson again. And there's some reason to believe that the Stevenson recruitment and the guy that Jeff mentions there, the other four-star defensive back, Elam, their recruitment could be a little different. Stevenson has liked Georgia for a long time, signing with Georgia back in December and announcing that in January. It was maybe a little easier for him to do, just given the long-standing nature of his relationship. But when it comes to the absence of a defensive coordinator, at least named, absence of a defensive backs coach, that guy, as of right now, is not on the coaching staff. For a guy like Tyreek Stevenson, from a player talent standpoint, very similar to Elam, Stevenson has said that didn't really matter to him all that much. So as a way of maybe sort of explaining the other side of this, why the absence of this kind of coach is maybe not that big of a deal, we'll turn our attention back to Tyreek Stevenson and what he said on that subject back in the beginning of the month, right after he announced George at the All-American Bowl. Here's what he told Jeff Sentell then.
Why was it Georgia?
Just me being comfortable with Coach Smart and trusting what he says, and, being comfortable with the team and the facility. So that's why with the Coach Tucker situation, they hit me up first. They let me know what's going on. They told me don't panic. I trusted that. So them are factors right there.
So here is where we are on all of this. Maybe it's a big deal the coach is not in place. There's some reason to believe that might be. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. For a guy like Tyreek Stevenson, it kind of wasn't. One thing for sure, though, the recruiting that's going to go on at Georgia this weekend is a big deal. And the guys that are on staff, whether it be a guy like Bakari Rambo kind of thrust into a bigger and better duty, or a guy like James Coley, who's actually retweeted some stuff with Elam in the last few days here, the ones that are on hand are going to be doing some big work for UGA. And we'll see if the Dogs can make a nice close to the 2019 recruiting cycle as we head towards National Signing Day in February. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you. Thank you for being with us. Live on video today, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on all those video channels for you, and we're glad to have you with us there. We're also on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we're available as a podcast wherever podcasts can be found, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. It's kind of the on-demand audio version of our program, and on a day like this, as this coaching search rolls on, maybe by the time you hear the show, maybe there'll be some good news to present on that subject. But as of right now, we know where we are, and that's with no defensive backs coach in place. So if you hear this later on the weekend, we appreciate you checking us out whenever you can. And, of course, we'd love to check you out in person, or you check us out, or either way, whatever. We're going to be at a great Marlowe's Tavern location coming up really soon. And if you've never been with us for one of these events before, you're going to want to really make plans to do this for the first time ever for us at the Marlowe's Tavern in Kennesaw. What an exciting thing to be able to say. We're heading up to Cobb County, really for, I think, the first one of the very first events we've done in Cobb County. 745 Chastain Road is the address right there in Kennesaw. The Marlowe's Tavern there for our Countdown to Signing Day event. It's from 6 to 8 p.m. there that night. Jeff Sentell, those will really be the final stages towards the National Signing Day. And in terms of how Georgia's going to do and try to steal some of these big names that are still out there, there could be some really fun stuff to talk about that night. It's Tuesday, January 29th from 6 to 8 p.m. The Marlowe's Tavern in Kennesaw. Once again, 745 Chastain Road. We would love to have you come out and join us for that. Speaking of Jeff Sentell, we will get him coming up in a moment. Before that, though, there was something, really a couple things on the internet the last couple of days that I found to be pretty interesting as it relates to Andrew Thomas. Now, when you talk about like big names around Georgia, I don't know that Thomas is necessarily one of the more famous Georgia players. If you want to look at like who typically gets the most attention on the internet, it's a guy like Jake Fromm, and he's gotten some more of that over the last couple of days. It's a running back like DeAndre Swift. The ex-Georgia players like Roquan Smith and and Chubb and Michelle. Those guys were always featured in the national publications. Those guys were always hot topics on Twitter and everything else. Thomas has been one of those guys that, like a lot of offensive linemen are, has kind of had to, work his way into the limelight. And Thomas is probably a guy that probably shies away from that limelight a bit. But when you look at Georgia heading into 2019, I know Connor Riley wrote about this a little bit at DawgNation.com this week, but when you look at the situation with Andrew Thomas, I think you can make a case that Thomas might be Georgia's single most important player. He was listed in a way too early All-American ranking from ESPN, the guys that ESPN, at least really, really early in the process, predicting to be first-team All-Americans next season. Andrew Thomas's name was on that list. CBS Sports recently did its top 32 prospects for the 2020 NFL Draft. That would be Thomas leaving after his junior season. Thomas was in the top 10 of that. So you've got a guy right now, early projections, first-team All-American, really early projection, top 10 pick potentially in the 2020 NFL Draft. That's a guy that Georgia's got to utilize. That's a guy that Georgia's got to build its entire offense around, both in terms of mauling people in the running game and really establishing an opportunity protecting the blind side for Jake Fromm to have a really big year. But now to listen to Kirby Smart talk about this when it comes to Andrew Thomas, that no matter how big of a draft prospect he turns out to be, and no matter how many All-American accolades that he brings to the program, the thing that Kirby's looking for from Thomas, the role that he wants him to grow into, is more than just the guy that you go out there and watch do his job every single Saturday. He also wants him to step up his vocal leadership as well. He said this, before the start of the 2018 season and over the course of the 2018 season. That's a role that I think that Thomas has really lived into, and I'm guessing that Kirby wants more of that moving into 2019. So let's go back and hear some of Kirby from the past on Thomas as an example of what he's looking for, I think, this year, what could be his final year from Georgia's left tackle.
The challenge for Andrew is, can he become a vocal leader, not just a leader by example? He's got to learn to push other guys and challenge other guys along with Lamont. And I think he can be that kind of impact leader.
So the Lamont mentioned there is obviously Lamont Gilliard, one of the leaders from last year's offensive line, who won't be back for 2019. And I believe that football is one of those sports where I think leadership requires credibility, and the only way you gain credibility in football is by being a good player. And in the case of Andrew Thomas, if he really is indeed going to be an All-American and a top 10 pick in the next spring's NFL Draft, all of a sudden that credibility as a leader just goes up because people want to be where Thomas himself is going, and listening to him, I think a lot of players are going to believe that's going to help get them there in that regard. That's a really exciting thing to think about. And when it comes to being this vocal leader and saying the right things for Georgia, Thomas is already a guy that has an example of doing just that. In a lot of ways, he had a vision for the Georgia offensive line the moment he became a starter at right tackle back in his freshman season of 2017. And what he believed then after his first year, I think he also takes with him into what could be his final year in 2019 as well. A Georgia offensive line that really sets the tone for that entire side of the ball. Here is Andrew Thomas with maybe a preview of what we'll see more of here in 2019.
Well, we just tried to change the culture, and basically we just play physical every day. And it starts in practice. We practice hard every day. It starts with our O-line coach, Coach Pittman, and he just pushes us to be the best we can be.
So a lot of times you think about that playing physical, you think about it in the dominant running game, and certainly Georgia's done that. But I do think for Georgia to win a national championship this upcoming season, there is also the additional wrinkle of the passing game that has to be brought in here. That's the other thing you've got to add into this discussion. And frankly, it ought to be easy to establish that if you've got a top 10 pick left tackle. It ought to be easier for the other four offensive linemen. It ought to be an easier job for the quarterback and the wide receivers and everything else. That is an incredible luxury that Georgia has in its place right now. And I am really interested to see how that's used. So, on shows like this one, we are probably guilty from time to time of talking too much about quarterbacks and running backs and what we think of as kind of the skill position, superstar type players. But in terms of the foundation that could really lead Georgia to a national championship, Thomas may be the bedrock of all of that. And the fact that he's already getting some All-American attention, already getting some NFL draft attention, I think goes to show you just how true that might end up being. We'll get Jeff Sentell coming up in just a moment. Before that, though, let's kick off the weekend here with our Kroger kickoff, giving you a preview of what's to come here for UGA Athletics. And as you might expect, it is a busy weekend for a lot of the teams that compete this time of year, starting tonight as the Gym Dogs host Alabama. Alabama historically has a really good program. So that should be a fun meet there in Stegman Coliseum tonight. Gym Dogs hosting Alabama. Tomorrow, men's basketball's got Florida coming into Stegman Coliseum. That's noon. I believe that game's on CBS, I think that's a pretty good TV spot for Georgia, Florida tomorrow. It's actually kind of a nice spot for the Dogs here in that their start to conference play with Tennessee and Auburn and Kentucky, obviously pretty rigorous. A little bit of a step down in competition, at least right now, for Florida, although the Gators did play Tennessee close the other night. So we'll see if the Dogs can get a much-needed home SEC win against Florida on Saturday. And, of course, Gator haters always like watching the Gators go down. Then the Lady Dogs host Texas A&M on Sunday. And, of course, we're all looking forward to National Signing Day coming up on February 6th. That's what's happening this weekend as we kick off the weekend with our Kroger kickoff here on DawgNation Daily. And by the way, speaking of Kroger, they've got a great deal and offer for you right now. You can earn 3 times the fuel points on hundreds of items throughout your local Atlanta Kroger store. It's all bakery cookies, it's floral plants, it's pet items, and you can do that now through January 22nd. So just go check out your local Kroger store today, and that is going to be a lot of fun. And don't forget about Kroger Chef Jr. At participating locations this Saturday as well. All right. I want to get into the Brian Harrion stuff from Chip Towers later on. I want to deal with the D'Angelo Gibbs news later on. We'll do all of that. But as we said off the top, it's a big weekend for UGA recruiting. Let's find out more about that. Let's welcome in Jeff Sentell here to DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Say hello to Jeff Sentell here on this Friday, always providing great coverage of everything happening with the world of UGA recruiting. And so we don't have Jeff. Okay, so the music played. I thought Jeff was ready to roll. We will get Jeff coming up in just a minute, and we'll, I think probably for the purposes of our radio and podcast audience, we'll fire up the music one more time on that too. While we're waiting on Jeff, we'll get some of your comments and allow you to get a chance to speak here on this Friday. We appreciate you being with us. Hope you all are getting ready for a really fun weekend, as we said a moment ago with our Kroger kickoff, kicking off the weekend. Hopefully you're getting ready to kick off some fun here too, and we appreciate you allowing DawgNation Daily to be a little bit of a part of that. All right, we do have Jeff Sentell ready to go now, so those comments will come in just a moment. We will get those all squared away and taken care of. But for the purposes of the continuity of the show, let's fire the music one more time and welcome in Jeff here today.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Happy Friday to you, Jeff Sentell. Appreciate you being with us. Thanks for your time today. How are you doing?
Good, man. Happy Friday, man. Hope the continuity and everything works out and the theme music dies down and we can talk about Georgia recruiting.
No doubt about that. Thanks for being with us. And we started our show today, Jeff, by replaying something you had said on Tuesday. And, you talked about the idea that if there was no defensive backs coach in place by Friday, it could be a problem for a recruiting weekend with a guy like Kyrie Elam expected to be on hand. It's Friday. There's no coach, at least as we're doing this on a Friday morning. How worried should Georgia fans be about all this?
Man, Brandon, worry them up today on Friday, man. I would think, the official visit, usually the young man flies in, that they start on Friday evening. Friday, Saturday, there's a 48-hour clock. I would still say there's at least 12 hours or maybe 6, 7, 8 hours before anybody can start looking at those fingernails or chomping on some sunflower seeds and worrying about the coordinator and the defensive back coach. Remember, doesn't really need to be publicly announced and spread all across social media in the Dog Nation for the future defensive coordinator and defensive back coach to be known to those key official visitors over the weekend.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess what you're saying is there's a chance they could tell Kyrie Elam, or I guess, somebody else, a Nick Cross, somebody like that too, they could tell them something that's not available for public consumption. And I guess there's a chance that could happen. And if it does, we'd probably never know about it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's, ideally some of the guys might even already have a good hint about who these positions are going to be, and they're just waiting for things to sort themselves out. But really, again, Brendan, it's not what we need to know. It's what these recruits need to know while they're on the official visit, so they're able to process and have all the information that they need to make these key life-changing decisions.
So I want to talk more in depth about Elam here in a moment, but just kind of a general overview for the people who are, just kind of getting focused in on this subject here for a moment. if you want to lay the overview of what's going to happen this weekend with Georgia from a recruiting standpoint, what are kind of things to know here right now?
Wow, open-ended, that thing could go a long way. I think the bigger thing is everybody's going to focus on what's going to take place with 2019 visitors like Brett Seitzer, the tight end he's out of Maryland, but he's a three-star tight end that's picked up a lot of interest. There's also Elam, who's the nation's number 7 quarterback prospect for this year. Now, Kyer is one of the top 51 recruits in the country. That's a major get for Georgia. It appears to be Georgia or Florida right there. You've also got the continued pursuit of 5-star receiver George Pickens. Will he be in town this weekend? Will he be in town on another weekend? What's Georgia's shot there? Is he going to stick with Auburn? Is he going to give DawgNation and this guy who hosts a daily podcast the sort of 5-star receiver that would have him standing up on the table and doing the Tiger Woods fist pump? All that stuff remains to be seen. But I think maybe the more bigger thing for Georgia is this is the start where Georgia can really start building the 2020 class. A lot of key 2020s are going to start coming in over the next few weeks. Camille Burrows will be there. A lot of 2020 prospects. This is kind of the start, or this weekend could kind of be seen as maybe the bedrock for building a potential number 1 class in 2020.
So now, as good news as that would be for next December and February, there are a lot of Georgia fans, Jeff, you just know how this goes. There are a lot of Georgia fans who kind of take that as, that sort of sounds like eating your vegetables a little bit. What's a lot more fun, what's a little bit more like eating, a big old plate of fried chicken or, some barbecue, something a lot more tastier is the idea of really getting there and doing some work with one of those remaining 2019 names. But it sounds like, for a lot of Georgia fans, it's not as appealing to think that Georgia might not close with a big flurry here going towards February. No matter how much good work was done in December, there is going to be some disappointment if this February kind of goes out with a whimper.
Well, see, Brandon, here's where I guess maybe I'm just more big picture perspective type guy with all this, and I'm not seeking, or I don't think this class needs a great closing kick for news cycles and headlines. Let's look at the facts here. Georgia is closer to the number 1 class in 2019 than they are the number 3 class. They've got 5 5-stars signed. No other school has more than 3, and Georgia even lost 2 5-star commitments. So at one point, the class looked like it could beef up to 7. What I'm trying to say here is this is a mega class. It is a monster class that fits a lot of needs. Georgia could add 2 or 3 more names to the list before February the 6th rolls around. But to me, lots of people start grading classes, and they've already graded classes. I can't see any way this class is not A-plus class.
So with that said, let's look a little bit more deeply at Elam here for a moment. And I thought you brought in a great point on Before the Hedges on Wednesday that no matter how much guys like me may fixate on a different name, when you look at what Georgia really needs with the depth of wide receivers in a program like Alabama and the expected matchups in years to come in SEC championship games, another lockdown defensive back to get that job done would really help, and that's what Elam could be for Georgia. It seems like the Florida visit for Elam went well last week. Those visits typically do. There's obviously some family ties between Elam and the University of Florida, and I just sort of gather that while this is close, if I had to make someone a slight favorite, I guess I'd probably favor Florida over Georgia right now. So where do things stand specifically with Elam? The coaching part of this aside, because we've obviously done a lot of that now. Just in terms of the 2 schools themselves, am I right to say that by a slight margin, Florida is probably a little bit of a favorite for Elam over Georgia right now?
Man, I don't even know if I would say that, Brandon. I mean, there's a lot of things in what you read, and then there's kind of reality with Elam. And Kyer just kind of looks at this. Remember, his father played 7 years in the NFL. His uncle played at Florida, so there's a little bit of a legacy there. But Elam has always struck me as a guy that's going to get it done, going to make it happen, and is on that 3 to 4 year path to the league wherever he wants to go. To me, I got it on good accord that he really loves Georgia. He really likes the fact of being at Georgia. He really loves the fact of being at Florida as well. It is likely that it will come down to Georgia or Florida for this decision. And so simply for what Elam's looking for is what is his surroundings going to look like? What is his environment going to look like? I think with Georgia, the ways it closes on Kaiir Elam is if they pick a defensive coordinator and they pick a defensive backs coach that he's fine with. If he has a relationship or really is on good footing fast with Georgia's future defensive backs coach, that's going to be a plus for Georgia. That might be the things that eventually separate Florida from Georgia. The big difference here, Brandon, if anybody wants to lean one side to the other or think this guy's going here or going there, is he knows what everything will look like at Florida. He knows who'll be the coach leading him in the position room. He knows what the defensive coordinator will be like. Georgia's previous guy in both those roles had NFL experience as a coordinator and had also played in major college football and had a proven track record of putting guys in the league. Georgia currently has unknowns there on that front, and the only way they outpace Florida in those areas is by filling in those blanks for Kaiir Elam.
But so once again, without kind of focusing on who Georgia might hire, because that's obviously a big issue in all of this, you did tell us a month or so ago that Elam was close with Mel Tucker, and beyond just who's going to be my position coach and who is going to be named as the defensive coordinator, there's also this thing of this relationship that was in place that's no longer there for Georgia. It seems like Georgia's done a pretty good job of kind of rebuilding that now that Tucker's gone. Would you mind speaking a little bit about that process of how is it that Georgia can regain or add to its relationship with Elam, knowing there was a specific name that he really liked that's no longer there anymore?
I mean, Brandon, I guess the simplest way to relate it to everyone is the connection was there with Tucker and it was strong. It might have eventually been the reason why Georgia outkicked Florida in the end for Kaiir Elam. So right now what Elam needs to see, it's kind of like any industry. Are you going to go work for somebody where you don't know who your immediate supervisor is going to be? Maybe you know who the general manager is going to be. Maybe you know who the CEO is going to be. I think this is a situation with Elam where he likes, let's harken back to some of those relationships we've reported about with Kaiir Elam and Tyreek Stevenson, for instance, Kaiir Elam and Lewis Keene. Lewis Keene was talking at the Under Armour All-American game about everybody that Kaiir needs to keep playing with these folks and come on and be a dog. Lewis was in his ear a lot that week in Orlando. And I think Lewis kind of looked at a lot of destinations, specifically Georgia, Florida. Those are places where he can play, he can perform, he can be showcased and get it done. I think simply Kaiir Elam's got a couple more options, a couple more weeks to make up his mind. And when I do, I think it's going to be a thoroughly vetted decision simply for the fact that he's got so many people. His father spent a lot of years in the league, is very well connected. His uncle spent all that time in Florida. He's going to make a very well-informed decision. And Kaiir has always struck me as a kid who had a very level head with all of this.
All right, so at this point, we got to talk about George Pickens here for a moment. And Jeff, I know at this point in time, I am certainly very well documented on the record as this being a player that I want. I'm obviously aware that this is a complicated recruitment for reasons, in some cases, that probably extend beyond football. I don't want to rehash everything that's been said on this because I've talked to you about this. We had our buddy Ben Walk on the show yesterday. I tried to get him to say what I wanted to hear on this. As of yet, I haven't really been able to coerce anyone into saying what I want to hear when it comes to George Pickens. So let me instead say this, Jeff, as a way of kind of furthering this conversation. I thought in the DawgNation forum, and I believe it was yesterday this thread got posted, Scooter Dog on the DawgNation forum on the specific subject of wide receiver recruiting. That's been a big issue for us here on DawgNation Daily. I thought the conversation on the forum was really nuanced and really good about what Georgia has done well when it comes to wide receiver recruiting, what might be to come for 2019 when a guy like Dominic Blaylock gets on the field, but also the element that I have certainly noticed of what has not been done yet and what seems to separate Georgia from the national championship winners of the last couple of years. I don't know if you saw the thread, Jeff, at the forum at forum.dawgnation.com, but what do you make of the actual, sort of facts on the ground when it comes to Georgia's wide receiver recruitment?
I think Georgia, and maybe the fan base in general, wants another Javon win. There's a little bit of heartbreak or moving on or hangover from the five-star receiver Georgia didn't get this year. The guy that's 6'3", 190 pounds, that big body receiver that can go up and get the ball when everybody's on them. And I think George Pickens is that next most likely suitor, the next person down the road for everyone to think about. Perhaps, Brandon, maybe the biggest reason why you're not getting what you want to hear, or the things that would really rally momentum and everybody think that George Pickens is happening and he's happening in this direction is because those decisions simply haven't been made yet. I mean, Pickens needs to take a final official visit to Georgia. He's going to weigh out his options. He's going to see where things are at. And then let's also remember, he's been committed to Auburn for a very long time. This in some ways should liken back for a kid from Alabama and some other schools taking a late run at one of Georgia's most valued targets that's still shopping around. I think with Pickens, he's a guy that gets it done. The film, the way he instantly takes over practices and drops jaws in the middle of workouts against other elite prospects, he is a very rare guy. That's why he's a 5-star. That's why he's a likely 3-and-out player. But I think Pickens, and the most safest and the most conservative way to talk about this, is there's still a long way to go with Pickens in a lot of areas.
So apart from Pickens here for a moment, Jeff, I actually want to talk about something else you brought up right there. You said what Georgia's looking for is another Javon Wims. Now, Jeff, I love Wims, and I was thrilled by some of the things he did for Georgia back in 2017. But Wims also had 700 yards receiving, 7 touchdowns, became a 7th-round pick. What I want to see Georgia get, Jeff, is a guy go 950 yards, catch 11 touchdowns, and get drafted in the first round. That's the level of achievement I'd love to see Georgia wide receivers find. It's the same level of achievement that we're starting to expect from the other position groups. Thorpe Award winner as a defensive back, Butkus Award winner as a linebacker, offensive linemen who are going to be drafted in the first round in years to come. You've got position groups at Georgia, not to mention, all the Georgia running backs who are obviously, lighting the NFL on fire. A 7th-round draft pick for most position groups at Georgia wouldn't even turn heads whatsoever, whereas Georgia, that's kind of the high watermark here as of late. That lid has got to be blown off one way or another, and there's some guys in this roster right now I think have a chance to do that. But that's kind of the point that I thought the forum thread was getting into yesterday. Riley Ridley could help change that reputation depending on where he gets drafted this spring, and I think that helps with the future. But really, I think the standard of achievement that Georgia can aspire to with the wide receivers, I don't think it's gotten anywhere close to that yet.
Okay, Brandon, here's at the point where I'm going to try and sound like a male version of Dr. Melfi from The Sopranos. I've identified what the issue is. I've identified the need. Georgia's developing higher echelon receivers like Jeremiah Holloman. But I think dadgummit, DawgNation wants to see Georgia sign a receiver coming in that looks like the 3 they have at Clemson right now, and it looks like the 4 they have at Alabama right now. Because at every other position on the board, Georgia's been able to match those elite programs, star for star and prospect for prospect, with those elite guys, with those guys that look like future first-rounders when they sign. And really, the only guy that we have to come back to that Georgia's had that can do that is Dominic Blaylock. But even Dominic Blaylock is not the 6'3", 200-pounder, the guy that's going to catch all those back shoulder fades in the end zone. And I think that's maybe the last remaining recruiting frontier that everybody wants to see the Bulldogs end up with on a signing day.
Yeah, that's 100% true. Let me finish up on a couple more lighthearted notes here for a moment. First of all, I tweeted this out last night. I was very happy to see Kirby Smart, who's been very busy on the recruiting trail as of late. Not busy hiring a defensive backs coach, I don't guess, but certainly busy recruiting. I'm glad to see we've upgraded here to a red helicopter there in Athens, or not in Athens. It's everywhere but Athens, I guess. Jeff, we go from yellow in 2016, which is just a flat no, and that's a hard pass, to black most recently, and now showing up yesterday in the red helicopter. I think we got a little video we can show of that. I got to tell you, Jeff, I think the red helicopter there's a pretty big upgrade.
You think that's a sign or some foreshadowing? There's so many journalists that cover the Georgia beat. I'd actually like to see somebody cook up some numbers about how much it is to rent a helicopter. I wonder if some commutes, if 4 or 5 buddies in a certain subdivision could ever get together and carpool with a helicopter on some busy days, whether or not that would be fruitful, because it looks like he's taking helicopter rides in lots of different places. Stockbridge, Florida. I mean, he's down there. I mean, I think the biggest question I get on the forum is somebody sees a Kirby copter appearance and they want to know, where's he going to go see? Who's he going to go see? And I think that's what recruiting coverage is all about. I mean, one of those stops down there in Florida was to see a 6'7" defensive lineman, the type of guys that Georgia hopes everybody to be signing this year. And that's kind of where he goes all across the state. The trip to Stockbridge was to see Eagles Landing Christian cornerback Justin Robinson. He's about 6'3", 6'4", one of those wide receiver types, though, Brandon. The reason I said cornerback there is that's what he played a lot in the state championship game. Flashed the ability to play cornerback, but he's rated as a wide receiver. And, there's a lot of things going around DawgNation today besides, like, helicopters. Everybody wished Nolan Smith a happy birthday today. He's in Athens today. Today's his birthday. And then, kind of coming up on the site right now, I was putting it together right as the DND call came through, is I think maybe one of the most fascinating video kicker stories I've ever seen that I'm putting together is Georgia just offered a 5-star kicker. And everybody knows that maybe kickers normally don't move the dial on page view interest or fan interest, but look at the way Georgia reveres its kickers with guys like Hot Rod Blankenship. There are about 2 or 3 things from this young man out of North Carolina that literally will make you drop your jaw about how talented this 5-star kicker is out of North Carolina, and he's in the 2020 class as well.
There you go. That's pretty exciting. There's one more piece of video I wanted to make sure we showed here. And once again, if you're listening radio or podcast, I do apologize for this. I try not to do too much video-only stuff. But, Jeff, did you see from his Twitter feed the 5-star defensive end Brian Brzee? Now, I've said a million times, I'm a really big fan of defensive linemen that can play basketball. Trayvon Walker's athleticism, I just think, is off the charts. That's a 1,000-point, 1,000-rebound guy at Upson Lee. He may be a better basketball player than Brian Brzee based on this one dunk, but if a Georgia recruit dunks a basketball, I'm going to show it on this screen if I have a chance to. What'd you make of Brzee tossing the ball off the backboard, going and get it with one hand and kind of throwing it down? I guess that's a reason why he's the number 1 player for 2020, when you can do that kind of stuff.
I think it's pretty simple. That guy's a 6'5", 6'6.5", maybe some change at 285 pounds, defensive end. That's a guy that's going to have his hand on the ground, and he's doing very much skill guy type things. He comes from a huge athletic family of athletes. There's basketball players, there's linebackers, there's Hall of Fame junior college basketball players in his family tree. And, Brzee really likes the G. That's basically all I can say there.
Well, Jeff, it's great to have you on the program today. We appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to reading a bunch from you, including, sounds like you've got a great Sentell Intel piece going up at DawgNation.com. So we'll check that out, and we'll look forward to speaking to you soon.
5-star kickers, guys. That's something to read about today.
There you go.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So honesty compels me to admit, and if you're not watching, you'll have to take my word on this. The Brzee dunk, I think it's awesome that he can dunk, and the fact that he tossed off the backboard and catches with one hand is a pretty good piece of athleticism. I guess the dunk could have been a little bit better, right? Connor Riley, one of our producers who y'all know, he's giving it a 6 out of 10. I think my problem on this is, and maybe we could show it one more time. I know we just showed it 50,000 times. I think my problem is, what I love about football players dunking basketballs is the way the rim snaps down. In this case, I don't really get that breakaway rim snapping down here. I don't really get the stanchion shaking the way that I typically like to see that. I love a good dunk as much as anybody, and I love the fact that Brzee can dunk. I got to go with Connor. I may give it a 7.5 just because he does catch it off the backboard. Not a great dunk, though. I feel like Brzee's got a better one in him than that. I bet you Trayvon Walker can really get up and throw it down, because there's some video that got shared last year of him blocking shots and things like that. The way that he gets up and blocks shots, there's no doubt that a Walker can probably really send it in. As many of you are aware, he's not an early enrollee at Georgia because he's still playing basketball for Upson Lee. So I wouldn't mind seeing some of those guys have a dunk contest. I've always said that you put that on TV, anybody would watch it. These football prospects just throwing down major dunks, people would like that. Something else that I like as we start our SEC through here, the drama at Alabama. Now, listen, some of this, we had some Alabama fans who watched the show yesterday in the comments section were saying, BA, this is wishful thinking on your part. Maybe so. But boy, you can start to see some cracks in the mortar here. I said yesterday, the way that it all goes down with Tosh Lapoy really makes it seem like that Nick Saban is kind of building it up for one big final run, and the end for him may come sooner rather than later. I'm not going to change my mind on that until I see evidence that supports another viewpoint. It looks like Saban's in win now mode, and there's really interesting reporting from Bruce Feldman at The Athletic about, not a very well-kept secret that Saban's not always really a great guy to work for, and one of the examples that was cited was Dan Enos, a quarterbacks coach, who was, I guess, according to AL.com, in the mix for the Georgia offensive coordinator job this year. Certainly was in 2016, really thought to be a really good coach. Well, supposedly leaving Alabama to go take the job at Miami as offensive coordinator. He didn't even tell Saban bye, that he basically just like checked out of his office. I think the word that got used was ghosting, that he just sort of disappeared. Well, Enos has fired back on this on Twitter. I sort of think of this as kind of a non-denial denial, but what Enos says is, I would never leave an employer without telling them I was doing so. No ghosting here. Nothing but respect for CNS, which stands for Coach Nick Saban in Alabama. I love the fact that Enos is basically a message board poster with some of these abbreviations. He says, bottom line, business is business. It was time for me to exit. Wish all the best to RTR, which stands for Roll Tide Roll, CNS, and the program. Let me tell you something. Based on that tweet and the actions, this is a guy that doesn't like Nick Saban because he calls him an employer. Not, it's like your employer. That's a very cold way of doing that. CNS with the abbreviation. So a lot of people are going to paint this as Enos himself not looking very good because he didn't stand up, look Saban in the eye and telling him he was leaving. Maybe that's a mistake on Enos's part. I think there's another reading on this, that Enos didn't think Saban was worthy and deserved to hear a look in the eye and saying that I'm going. A lot of people don't like working for Saban. Now, in some respects, that's because of how hard driving and successful Saban's been. I would suggest that isn't the only reason that sometimes people don't like working with Nick Saban. So in this case, Saban in a situation where he's got to replace a lot of these coaches again. Maybe some of those he wanted to replace. Maybe some of these he didn't exactly want to replace. It sounds like Enos was a guy he was hoping to keep. This is kind of a very interesting situation. Another kind of interesting situation. Now, listen, I could go all day long on secondary violations in the NCAA. I think to a certain extent, secondary violations are kind of their own version of a scam here in terms of it's a flood the zone with information to hide the real stuff that's going on. Couldn't help but notice, though, that looks like Tennessee in one of the secondary violations they've been forced to report to the NCAA involves Philip Fulmer being at practice and providing instruction at a Tennessee football practice. Y'all, I've been saying this forever. I've been saying this for over a year. And with every piece of evidence that comes out, I get proven more and more right about this. Philip Fulmer cannot keep his hands off the Tennessee football program. This is a careerist that's trying to move and step up every step of the way. Now he's getting NCAA violations for almost acting like a coach at practice. You're the athletic director, and you kind of weaseled your way into that job. How about you stick with the job you have? And if I'm a Tennessee fan, I'm saying, let Jeremy Pruitt run this program. How much must Pruitt hate this? And how big is this blow-up, this powder keg? How big is this blow-up eventually going to be? All right, a couple quick stories to get to here as well. This is actually good news for Tennessee. At least it looks that way. Charles Kelly, one of the defensive backs coaches with the Vols, was maybe thought to become Mike Loxley's defensive coordinator at Maryland. Football Scoop is now reporting that's not going to happen. Tennessee holding on to that guy. I think when possible, continuity is a pretty good thing for a program. For an up-and-coming coach like Pruitt not to have to go out and look for another defensive assistant this late in the process, that's probably a piece of good news there for Tennessee. And I guess conversely, Georgia fans like bad news for Tennessee, so maybe the opposite for UGA fans. Then I saw where, and I'm not even sure who reported this first, but it looks like Urban Meyer may be on his way to being another TV analyst. Not with ESPN, I don't think this time. I think it's a Fox Sports deal. They have a lot of those Big Ten games, and gosh, this is just so predictable. I mean, Meyer is just, transparently phony. He's going to be on TV for a year, and I'm guessing he's probably coaching somewhere, some big job by 2020 as well. So Urban Meyer's going to do what he's going to do, and we'll make that your SEC through. And here on DawgNation Daily, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes kind of dealing with a couple of other stories that have been kind of out there. One of these is a piece of news. One of these is more of a kind of a piece of analysis. The news involves D'Angelo Gibbs, and I'll get to that in a moment. I want to invite you to check out the piece that Chip Towers wrote at DawgNation about Brian Herrien, though, the Georgia running back. And Chip's point is that Herrien could have transferred, and I guess Chip's got some reporting that suggests that Herrien did consider transferring, but chose not to, chose to stay at Georgia. Now, it's easy to overlook Herrien just given the fact that Georgia's got a 5-star running back in Zamir White coming back from injury, James Cook, another very elite running back, DeAndre Swift's a superstar. But don't count out Brian Herrien in that competition to really earn himself some playing time. And remember the moments in which Herrien has played that he's actually proven himself to be a very capable runner. Read this piece at DawgNation to maybe change the way that you view Harrion in his potential pecking order in this Georgia running back competition. And as a reminder to all of this, some of the stuff sometimes we don't see, practice, scrimmages, things like that, those are apparently some of the moments when Harrion has been the most effective. Here's an example of what Kirby Smart said about him in the past.
I don't know that it would be a progression for Brian Harrion because Brian's been really consistent since being here, in my opinion. You guys only get to see the finished product on the field, and you go off results and you go off stats, where I'm going off the body of work for 2 springs where I've seen this guy. The run he made where he spun off a tackler, I mean, that's a common occurrence in spring practice. He makes guys miss in the hole. He's quick. Brian's a good runner. I mean, I don't think it's been a progression. I think it's been, since he's got here, he's a good football player. He's really been an asset for our team on special teams, and he got to make the plays that counted the other day. He provided a spark and juice that sometimes he doesn't get an opportunity to because he's on the sideline. And when he's out there, he did a good job. And I thought he took advantage of his opportunities.
I got my eye on Brian Harrion in 2019. I think you probably ought to as well. You may be aware by now that D'Angelo Gibbs is reportedly on his way to Tennessee. As 24/7 Sports, Grant Ramey has this first. Sounds like he's going to play wide receiver once he gets there. That's something a lot of Georgia fans wish he could have done at Georgia. I've been very clear in the past that, I would have loved for things to have worked out differently with Gibbs. I think that Gibbs is an amazing talent as a defensive back. I think he could have been a really special player at Georgia. It just wasn't in the cards here. And I'm going to commend Kirby Smart for, I think, trying to handle this situation the right way. I'm for second chances. I'm for giving guys some latitude to earn their way back onto a football team. And in the case of Kirby Smart, that's exactly what I think went on here. Let's go back to last summer for a moment when, Gibbs was back in school and Smart was trying to, help him get back here, but certainly not going to give him anything for free without him earning it. Let's go back in time with Kirby on Gibbs from back in the summer.
He's working and doing the things we ask, and he needs to continue to do that, and we'll make a decision when the time comes. But being enrolled in school doesn't signify that he's with our roster right now.
I mean, that's what you want a coach to be able to say there. There's a standard for getting back on this team. There's a standard for being back towards our program. We're going to allow guys to have a chance to do that. In the case of D'Angelo Gibbs, that sounds like what was happening. But it just, for whatever reason, was not going to work out here. And you certainly get the impression that Kirby Smart tried to provide that opportunity. Here's more of Kirby talking about that very same thing.
That's probably a little premature on y'all's part. I think that nothing's done with D'Angelo Gibbs until he's back with us, and that verdict's still out right now.
The premature reference there from Smart is about Gibbs being in school back spring semester a year ago, not, as Kirby was saying, signifying that Gibbs was necessarily going to be a big part of the team. He ended up getting back on the team, though, but at the Sugar Bowl, as you know, was kind of not with the team then. Now he's going to Tennessee. I don't know what impact he's going to make there. I wish him well in life in general, and I guess we'll see if this ends up having any impact whatsoever in the SEC East race. One thing to keep in mind is, Gibbs got some family ties to Nigel Warriors on that roster, Dale Carter as well. So, there were already some kind of family ties there. Obviously, Pruitt and Gibbs from the recruiting world kind of go back a long way, too. So it's easy to understand those ties that Gibbs would have to Tennessee. And, honestly, I'm not going to say a bad thing about him, even going to a Georgia rival like that. I think he's got some stuff going on that, certainly I hope that he gets that all figured out. And obviously these kinds of transfer issues around college football, they're not going away anytime soon. So the weirdness of a player being at Georgia than being at Tennessee, there's probably going to be a lot more of that in the years to come. With that said, though, speaking of SEC East race, the rivalry in the SEC East we think matters more than any other is that one with those lousy, stinking Gators. And it has now been 811 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is certainly a great way to close out the weekend. Our Gator Hater Updater right here on DawgNation Daily. We'll talk to you on Monday, everybody. And on video, while I pull up the comments, one thing I was going to mention at the very end of the broadcast and just didn't have time to, is I mentioned earlier that CBS Sports had Andrew Thomas in the top 10 of its top 2020 draft prospects. Thomas was in the top 10 there. They also had Fromm at number 2, I want to say. I think it was Tua Tagovailoa 1, Fromm 2, and then Fromm was ahead of Herbert, the Oregon quarterback, at number 3. It's really interesting how much the national media is buying into the idea that Fromm's a big-time draft pick at quarterback next spring. Not this upcoming draft, of course, but for the 2020 draft. That's a big thing in the national media right now. Eric Moody gives you his own version of the "and" on video. At this point in time, I just sort of say that now because y'all are going to kind of expect it. So it started off as kind of a verbal tick, a habit, and now it's kind of turned into just something I feel like I kind of need to do every single week. Richard Pollard brings up an interesting name. That's Micaiah Tongue. I think that Tongue's a really interesting prospect. And one of the things I like about Tongue potentially is, obviously I think of him as kind of I'm not even really sure what his overall, measurable specs are, but I think of him as a little bit of a bigger receiver, someone that's almost like a fast tight end in some cases. I think that's kind of an interesting name there. Now, I know at some point in time he may slide over and play defensive back because that's a guy that could also make a big impact on the defensive secondary. And, as much as I want Georgia to have receivers, if I've got a choice of playing on one side of the ball or the other, I'm going to put the elite athlete on secondary just because I think it's especially, I think that can be a hard position to fill. But I think that Tongue's an interesting player. And Joel Moody also references that as well. I think Tongue could play either side of the ball. It'll be interesting where he ends up playing. Joel, I think you're right about that. Matt Rukavina asking the question about Jake Fromm. I mentioned what CBS Sports had said about him being they have him as a top 2 pick in 2020. Now, this is also very, very early in the process. These things are going to change a lot. But what Matt says is, isn't he more of a 4-year guy? And that's the point I'm kind of making here. No disrespect, but it's almost like the Georgia fan assumes that Fromm will be a 4-year guy, that he's going to have to grow into that role of maybe being a first-round draft pick if that's indeed the status that he eventually rises to. The national media is not treating him that way. Now, there's also a lot going on with quarterbacks for that 2020 draft, and that's one of those years where, and I don't follow NFL that closely, but we're heading for a potential lockout, I think, in 2021. So there could be a thought that next year could be just the barn doors swinging open for guys going into the NFL draft because of the risk of not getting paid right away in 2021. But it's kind of funny that the Georgia fan seems to be like Matt Rukavina saying, well, I think that Fromm's going to stay all 4 years. The national writer seems to be like Chip Patterson from CBS Sports, who says maybe Fromm could be the number 2 overall pick in 2020. I don't know what that means necessarily, but in this case, the national evaluation of Fromm is a lot more favorable, seemingly, than the average Georgia fan is. Richard Raines Jr. says, who do you see stepping in for DeAndre Baker next year? I think that's a great question. I think that your starting cornerbacks at Georgia for next year very likely could be the same tandem that started in the Sugar Bowl with Tyson Campbell on one side and Eric Stokes on the other. And frankly, Stokes, based on what we saw from him the second half of the season, has turned out to be a better player than I assumed that he would be. I really saw some moments where I thought he broke on the football and made some incredible plays. So Stokes is a guy that I actually have kind of an interesting I'm very interested to see what he does more of. And y'all know I've been high on Campbell, and I think that he's going to grow into that role really nicely next season as well. I think the other name to kind of keep in mind when it comes to that kind of stuff, before you even get to a freshman like Stevenson, what he might be able to do. But for a guy like Devod Wilson, who we've talked about, in this portion of our comments section a little bit, who was on the field for the Sugar Bowl, who's recovered from injury, who Kirby Smart's already said some complimentary things about. Maybe that's a star role for him, that 5th defensive back spot. Maybe he factors into some of that as well. But I'd watch those 3 names: Devod, obviously Tyson Campbell, and Eric Stokes, the other cornerback. That I think could be really interesting. And I guess in terms of like the, who's going to play the field corner, who's going to play the boundary corner side of things, I guess that's probably a different discussion for a different day. Chris Branham says, don't forget DJ Daniel. That's a good point, Chris. Georgia doesn't typically go after junior college defensive backs. They wouldn't have gone after Daniel unless they thought he was capable of playing right away. That's a guy that does factor in that competition. You're absolutely right about that. John McMillan kind of saying the same thing. Justin Sutherland as well. You're right, y'all. I should have said him. Sooner than I did. I'm glad that you all brought that up. I still think the 3 guys that I mentioned are the favorites there. If you're talking about, apart from safeties, if you're talking about, the 3 guys that could be on the field, I would list the other 3 as the favorites over Daniel right now. But in terms of pushing and maybe, overtaking one of those guys, I would definitely think that DJ Daniel has a chance to do that. I'm glad y'all brought that up. Let me go over to YouTube here for a moment. We'll get some comments on here, too. And as I said earlier, I hope y'all are getting ready for a nice weekend. Garrett Murkison says, I think that Fromm will be like Aaron Murray and stay his full 4 years. It is kind of funny. in terms of the Fromm-Murray comparison. Obviously, a lot of people have done that in the past because physically they look similar. They wore the same number, of course, which doesn't really matter in terms of the overall valuation, but in terms of the comparison between the two, that probably aids that a little bit. And yet, here's where they seem to be different. Fromm will never put up stats like Aaron Murray. Go back and look at the statistical years that Murray had. It boggles the mind. I mean, he threw, just enormous stats, every single year, really, at the University of Georgia. I don't think Fromm's ever going to get close to those stats, and yet, Fromm is sort of being treated as the better overall NFL prospect. For Murray, he was a later draft pick and never really quite found a true home in the NFL. I think that's an interesting comparison why, even though they physically kind of look similar and statistically, Murray was actually, the superior of the two quarterbacks, at least after the first 2 years. But Fromm right now seems like he's going to have the better chance to have a big NFL career, at least based on the early reports from the national media. I think that's kind of an interesting comparison. Courtney Blackman says, how many more can we recruit? Bama is like 26. Yeah, Bama knew it was going to be able to sign a big class this year. That's one of the things that's helping it get the number one class. I guess we're down to the idea of it being either 2 or 3. Am I right about that numerically? Either 2 or 3, depending on how you crunch the numbers. That's probably where Georgia is right now. If you assume that Scyther, the tight end, ends up getting one of those spots, then you're down to either 1 or 2 then at that point in time. Diedrich Frazier says, I think we get tongue more on offense with the attrition of the receivers. So the other thing about that, too, is, Diedrich, I think you have to be mindful of what a guy wants to do. I think in the case of Micaiah Tongue, because guys generally do, they want to play receiver. And so I think Georgia's going to give him a shot there because that's what he wants to do. But a lot of these guys, they go through a period of self-discovery where they decide, okay, so I want to play receiver, but boy, think about how much money I can make in the NFL playing defensive back, and all of a sudden they kind of volunteer themselves to go over there. I mean, one of the things I don't like is what, like, say, Tennessee did last year with Alontae Taylor, where, he was kind of on the fence about, am I a defensive back or am I a wide receiver? And Tennessee said, hey, come here, you can be receiver. And yet from, like, day one, he was playing defensive back. It's like some of these teams, I don't know. It certainly seems like they tell recruits what they want to hear, and that kind of ends up not being true. Chime Dog says, now BA gets a chance to mention Pickens again. Listen, I told y'all a month ago that y'all are going to get tired of me saying George Pickens. I haven't, in all honesty, I haven't talked about him all that much today. We talked about him a little bit with Jeb. We have not done a whole bunch of George Pickens stuff on the show today. Jeremy Stark says, I'm just here to learn about recruiting in my area. I'm in Jacksonville, so I see a lot of SEC football. Jeremy, thanks for checking in on the show. Spencer Edwards says Richard LeCount needs to work on the fundamentals. He can be, he says, sloppy at times. Listen, I think we're all kind of aware there were some moments near the end of the season, and really probably throughout the season, but seemingly especially during the season, near the end of the season, where LeCount had some issues. Seemed to miss on some run-stop opportunities. Had a great interception in the SEC championship game. Go back and rewatch that play. He really did something pretty phenomenal to put himself in a position to get that ball. But he had some issues, and I think that LeCount would admit that. One of the things I'll invite you to go back and do, and maybe one day we'll play some of this. If you'll remember, back before the start of the season, there was a lot from Kirby Smart on, hey, one day it's a good day from Richard, one day it's not. And really a lot of challenging LeCount, calling him out publicly. And then the UGA sent LeCount out to talk to reporters one day. And LeCount really got a lot of questions on the hard coaching he was getting from Smart and the being challenged publicly. And LeCount stood there and took it all. And he really was very impressive that day. A very professional kind of outlook on, hey, I'm here to work hard and be as good a football player as I can. So you better believe, in terms of if there were some deficiencies in LeCount's game, and seemingly based on what we've seen, there probably were some. Richard LeCount is not ducking from that, running from that whatsoever. He's going to take that full on. He's going to be the first one to acknowledge any kind of shortcomings he may have. And I'm guessing that in the weight room and in everything else, he's doing everything he can to put himself in an even better position for 2019. So there's no doubt LeCount needs to improve. Like virtually everyone needs to improve, and the person that's going to acknowledge that the most is actually probably LeCount himself. Benjamin Banks says that he thinks that Tyson Campbell would flourish as a safety skill-wise. Jeff Sentell kind of thinks that too. And maybe one day that's what eventually ends up happening, that he goes on to be like one of these Minka Fitzpatrick-style safeties or something like that, a safety that can really run. Maybe that's what Campbell ends up doing. As it stands right now, I think that Georgia needs him at cornerback more because of the lack of athletes of that caliber at that position. Georgia's going to get Stevenson. It may get Elam. At that point in time, you may not need Campbell at cornerback quite as much, but as it stands right now, moving Campbell from a cornerback to a safety, I think there's a little bit of a loss there if that happens. I do. Spencer Edwards says, not bashing LeCount, just constructive criticism. Yeah, I mean, Spencer, I think people have been saying that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you do notice. You noticed it. You noticed it a few times, and I think LeCount's probably noticed that too. And I think he's gonna come back in a big way. I do. Richard Stovall says, I don't think anyone is really trash talking LeCount. No, I don't think so either. I don't. I mean, around here we do try to be careful with what we say about individual players, but I don't think there's anything wrong with offering just a fair evaluation of the events. So and so needs to be better. I don't think that's an unfair thing to say. Now, I think we've all noticed, whether it be message boards, social media, or maybe even a comment section on a show we've done. We know, like, an out of bounds comment when we see it or when we hear it. We know what that looks like. And in this case, I don't think that's what's going on, because one of the things I think is still true is that Richard LeCount is still among the most popular players on the Georgia roster. He's just a good guy. He kind of looks cool walking the stadium. He's got that bat on his shoulders. I mean, LeCount's still a very popular player. People want the best for him. Kirby Smart does. Kirby Smart would not have said some of the things that he said about him, near the beginning of the season if he didn't really have high hopes and a big belief in, LeCount. I mean, it's the same thing that your high school teachers probably told you, or your coaches in high school probably told you. It's like, they're kind of coming down hard on you. It's because they believe in you and they want the best for you. It's when they stop doing that kind of stuff that you got to be worried. That means they've kind of given up on you. Well, Kirby Smart's a long way from having given up on Richard LeCount. I can promise that, and I think all of you probably agree with that. Quabna Field says, we got Robbie Ashford, 2020 quarterback. Inside info. Well, listen, I hope that turns out to be true, because that'd be a great get for Georgia for 2020. Ashford looks like a pretty good player. Dean Butler says Baker wasn't lights out until his senior season. I don't know about that. DeAndre Baker's pretty good. Even from the moment he stepped on the field in 2016, kind of a smaller-looking guy, he was knocking balls out of the air even back then. So I understand the point you're trying to make, but the actual truth is I always thought Baker was pretty good, surprisingly so. GB2 asking about Robert Beal. Beal was a guy who flashed a little bit from time to time, and that was a guy I'd I hate to say it this way, but kind of forgotten about. I don't think that's a guy you forget about now. I think that's a guy may be able to play. Jimmy Allen says that Tom Crean's mother passed away. I did not know that. That's okay. That's true. I am so sorry to hear that. What a terrible thing for Crean to have to go through, and certainly our thoughts and prayers, condolences go out to him and his family. I'm so sorry to hear that. What a horrible thing to have happen here on a Friday. Crow King says prayers for his family. Yeah, indeed. So sorry for that. So y'all please keep the Crean family in there in your prayers at this busy time of year for him to have to be dealing with such a personal issue. And I know that she would have been very proud of her son, because he's turned out to be a really good coach and a really good guy. And I know that the Crean family's been honored by how Tom's lived his life. But I'm sorry for the loss of his mother here today. We will keep him in our thoughts as we kind of continue our football conversation here a bit. William Cobb asking about Nate McBride. I saw McBride on the field. I want to say it was the Georgia Tech game at linebacker. I saw him playing some at linebacker. If I'm wrong about that, y'all correct me. But I'm pretty sure I saw him on the field there at Tech as a linebacker. So I don't know what that means for him. I think, unfortunately for Georgia right now, or certainly from McBride's perspective, cracking the two deep at linebacker is just a really tough thing to do. Now, you can have a really good career at Georgia, making big plays in special teams and things of that nature, but cracking that two deep at linebacker, boy, It takes a real competition to be able to do that. And obviously McBride was a really good recruit, but that's a tough thing right now. Tough thing. Let me go over here to Facebook here for a moment. Good comments on YouTube. John Anthony says, anyone seen the 2020 commit Arik Gilbert from Marietta? I'm going to go ahead and warn y'all right now. One of the future recruits in the very near future who y'all going to get very tired of hearing me talking about is Arik Gilbert. I think that guy is one of the coolest looking athletes that I've seen Georgia go after in a while. As Jeff Sentell has pointed out, he could play a number of positions. And as it stands right now, a really athletic tight end for Georgia, which is what I think Gilbert's probably going to end up being, at least if I had to guess. What an interesting position that is, an interesting player that is. That starts to feel like a real must-get for me for Georgia's 2020 class. I love the idea of Arik Gilbert. Robert Barnes says, Gilbert's a bad man in a good way. Yeah, Robert, I think that's very well said. Rick Park says, please stop with the fullback comments. I think that's probably in reference to McBride. He says nobody uses fullback in modern football. But my knowledge is that, and Connor Riley watches the NFL a lot more than I do, you still see a decent amount of fullback in the NFL, right? I mean, so that, this idea that even as the NFL kind of looks a little bit more like college football, which looks a little bit more like high school football, and this stuff kind of trickles up, from the lower ranks, even as all this other stuff, the spread stuff, proliferates through the sport, you still see fullbacks in the NFL. And I'll give you an example of this. Living in Atlanta, my favorite NFL team is the Falcons. If you want to go back and look at the Kyle Shanahan year, and yes, I know it ends up with the disaster of the 28-3 comeback in the Super Bowl, but if you want to go back and look at the record-setting year that Atlanta had from a point-scoring standpoint, look at the way in which Atlanta used a fullback that season. Not giving him carries or anything like that, but just having him on the field. Really, the most efficient formations Atlanta used that year was with a fullback on the field. So, I'm one of those guys that I don't necessarily want to give a scholarship to a fullback, at least until he's earned it. But having a, what you call like a 21 or 22 personnel where you got two backs and two tight ends, I'd be fine with Georgia doing that. Now, I know some of y'all think I'm just 1,000 years old, but if Georgia lined up with a fullback, quarterback under center, at least some part of the time, I'd be fine with that. I want the versatility to be able to do, empty backfield, four wides, or like the 22 look where you got the two tight ends and the two running backs. I'm not of the belief that there's no place for a fullback in modern football. I don't want to spend one of my 85 scholarships on one, but putting a guy on the field, I don't necessarily have a problem with doing that. Connor Riley joined us, by the way.
Yeah,
I have thrown up the bat signal for Connor Riley.
If you, fullbacks, that really gets me going. If you're going to watch the AFC Championship game this weekend, you're going to see the Chiefs trot out there Anthony Sherman at fullback pretty regularly. And then if you're watching the Patriots, and hopefully you're rooting for Sony Michel, they put Pat Devlin, the fullback, back there a lot with him to sort of clear the way. And, even fullback with McBride or potentially whoever, there's also a theoretical H-back, which is sort of a hybrid between a tight end and a fullback. The Saints use that a lot with Taysom Hill. So it is something that you still see in modern football. And you mentioned Kyle Shanahan. Kyle Juszczyk is a very useful player for the 49ers out there.
Yeah,
so.
And by the way, speaking of bat signals, Chase Smith in our Facebook comment section says, bring back the toss sweep, the old school running play that you used to run on the I formation. You talk about throwing up the back signal. If Troy Sadowski is watching today, the great former Georgia tight end who's a really great commenter a lot of times on our Facebook comment section, you better believe we're going to be hearing from him in a second, because Troy is one of those guys that is a big believer because of the great offenses that he was a part of at Georgia, which did utilize the toss sweep, guys like Tim Worley and Rodney Hampton that Sadowski was blocking for in that regard. He has certainly made a case that Georgia ought to be toss sweeping more. So, Chase, you may have gotten Troy Sadowski stirred up on that one because he loves the idea of the toss sweep. But to go back to your Patriots for a moment, you like it when they have a full, because Connor, one of his few deficiencies is the fact that he is a Patriots fan. You like it when they have a fullback in the game, I'm guessing, right?
Well, I like it when they score points, and they score points when they have a fullback in the game.
There was an article a couple years ago about how efficient teams that use fullbacks are in the NFL. It was like The Ringer or something like that, a website you may have seen. It's actually not it's not a bad offense to still use. James Bryant says the H-back. Dan Henning, old NFL coach Atlanta. Just FYI. Yeah, I don't mind the H-back as well, that sort of hybrid tight end, fullback.
Auburn uses an H-back. Chandler Cox, that's what he was. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, that is very true. Philip Jordan,
I have a question for you.
Please, go ahead.
I need you to actually answer this because I have a feeling you're going to try and dodge it.
Uh-oh.
Who do you think is a straight-up better wide receiver, George Pickens or Dominic Blaylock?
Oh, I'm not answering that because I don't know.
Come on. Oh, so
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
My issue with the Pickens thing, for those, now you're going to get me in trouble with people. People are going to be yelling at me for talking about George Pickens too much. My issue with Pickens is not that he's better than Dominic Blaylock, because I honestly don't know. My issue is I want them both in the hopes that one of them can become the big-time player. I don't do the individual evaluations very much. I don't. I don't trust my own individual evaluations. I don't really trust your individual evaluations. I don't like specific scouting. It goes in one ear and out the other. When even these guys that I think of as experts, including our own buddy Jeff Sentell, I don't put a lot of faith and stock into individual evaluations. I just don't.
Can I ask you another question?
Okay.
You can only have one, Blaylock or Pickens. Which are you picking?
I'm fine with the guy that I've got. If I can only have one, I'm fine with the guy that I've got.
That's not the question that I asked.
If
straight up, you could have one or the other, regardless of whether or not Blaylock's already signed. I know my answer. I want to know what your actual answer is.
When you factor in the off-field stuff with Blaylock, I'm taking Dominic Blaylock there.
Okay.
I am. If you're only give me one. My problem with that is, in college football, there are no limitations on stuff like that beyond 85 scholarships. You can stockpile. It's one of the reasons why I've always liked college better than the NFL. You guys that are obsessed with the NFL, I could never do the thing where you get one first-round draft pick and you have to wait a whole day to pick another player. At Georgia, I can get 25 first-round picks and really hoard talent, so I don't have to be limited. But if I am limited in a hypothetical world, I'm fine with Blaylock being the guy over Pickens because there is an intangible quality with Blaylock that's really impressive. He does really like Georgia. I think that you've got to have some easy recruitments. I think one of the things that sometimes Georgia gets itself in a little bit of a bind with is it tries to fight 25 battles, and you can't have 25, knockdown dragouts for signees. You got to get a few easy ones. Otherwise, you can't win the ones that truly matter, the ones that you do have to fight for. I think that Blaylock is a really valuable addition. You're not going to paint me as anti-Blaylock here because you're not going to do that. You're not backing me in the corner on that. If I can only pick one, Blaylock's my guy. But national championships are won by stockpiling and hoarding guys at positions. And wide receiver is the one position where Georgia really hasn't done that.
It's a fair point. I would just, for all the talk about Justin Ross, those big body guys that you seem to love and fall in love with, the guy that cooked Georgia's secondary in the SEC championship game was Jalen Waddle.
That's a good point.
And he's my height,
Yeah.
And you look at some of the NFL, the best receivers, Antonio Brown, despite what he has going on off the field, he's not a big dude. Adam Thielen, he's not a big dude. Odell Beckham, despite what he has going on off the field, he's not a big dude. Body type in this day and age doesn't mean as much as it used to.
It is kind of funny, and somebody put this in one of our comment sections the other day about how many of the leading receivers in the NFL now are not really big, tall guys anymore. And I'll admit I probably didn't know that. But I'll also admit this. I didn't say this in the show because why would it? Nobody wants to hear this. But watching the SEC championship game that night, I was aghast at how good Jalen Waddle was. I had no idea.
Fastest football player I've ever seen. I think he's faster than Tyreek Hill.
I had no idea he was that good. Now, in the national championship game, he wasn't seemingly that big of a factor, but, he was very, very difficult to stop, obviously, for Georgia against Alabama. Waddle was a very impressive player. And you're right. It does change, this mold of what guys have to look like, and why every time I bring these guys up, everybody screams about Tommy Bush because he is the build of the kind of receiver that we're saying, or at least that I'm saying that Georgia needs. The Jalen Waddle thing is either the exception that proves the rule or the exception that defies the rule because he's not that big, and yet my gosh, he was just everywhere, and the speed was so elusive. He made, he really was impressive.
I agree.
So that's
I will say,
very important to bring
somebody
up.
asked how tall Blaylock is. He's right around that 5'11", 6'6" range. And yesterday we talked about the NFL first round SEC wide receivers. believe the only two that were 6'3" or taller were Mike Evans and Laquan Treadwell that we ran through. Amari Cooper is 6'1", Calvin Ridley 6'1", Odell Beckham's 5'11". You know, they're all sort of in that range. So just because you're not the biggest body dude out there doesn't mean that Blaylock can't come in and set the world on fire.
Shannon Baker also brings up a good point. Don't forget the UMass receiver. What was his name again?
Andy Isabella.
Every time
future Patriot.
Yeah. Every time somebody tweets about Isabella, I almost want to retweet it and say, this is the greatest football player of all time. Because if you were watching that game in Athens that day and you were told that he invented the sport, it would certainly look that way. Isabella was everywhere, all over the place, and he's also, not that big of a dude either. The one thing I think that could be good about Blaylock is as a high school guy, Blaylock's no waif. You know what I'm saying? He's not rail thin or anything like that. I like a receiver to have the ability to kind of turn his body and be able to step in front of a defensive back. Obviously, strength allows you to do that. I think Blaylock's already got some of that. He'll get more over the course of the summer. Arriving late doesn't certainly help there, but and by late I mean just the traditional enrollee date, not the early enrollee date. But I do think that one of the things that could help him is, as a guy that's a little bit different than the long receiver, is that ability to kind of turn his body on a defensive back and create that position. Because if you watch these guys in the NFL, that's one of the things that, even though I'm not just living and dying with every snap of the NFL, one of the things I do like watching is what constitutes being open in the NFL. It's a very different definition than what we have down here in the college ranks. And that ability to put yourself in a position to make a catch in the NFL counts as being open. I could see Blaylock doing that, running precise, crisp routes, but also just having the physical strength to turn his body and create that little bit of a post-up with a defensive back, especially over the middle, which is where Georgia needs to be more involved.
Right, and if you watch guys like Antonio Brown or Odell Beckham closely, a lot of people, they talk, and you've talked, and commenters have talked about how, with Trevor Lawrence, he threw a lot of 50-50 balls that Justin Ross caught and won those battles. Beckham and Brown with a lot of, 50-50 balls. It's just it's a different looking 50-50. It's much more of a tight window winning catch than, say, necessarily a, going up and jumping over and plucking the ball over the defensive back's head. But, those guys do it all the time. And I have full confidence that Blaylock, who I believe is better than Pickens, both on the field and by a wide stretch based off the stuff we've heard off the field. I believe, and, even some of the stuff you've seen with Hazelwood, I'll take Blaylock all day over Hazelwood, who's, complaining about coaches lying, and then, Lincoln Riley turns around and does what he does.
I don't think that's an unfair thing to say at all. Drayton Wilson says that when it comes to separation, he says footwork is the key, and I can certainly believe that could be true.
It's a great point.
Because of what Connor said about Blaylock off the field, and this is an extrapolation, because he is kind of a sharp guy off the field in terms of footwork and just sort of the precision with which you play the game, it's very easy to imagine Blaylock as being very good at that. You know what I'm saying? Like just the fundamentals, the way in which the game is played. It's very easy to imagine Blaylock committing himself to that craft. He comes from a family of athletes. It's easy to understand him committing himself to doing the game the right way, and that will help him get open.
You bring up, his family of athletes. His two brothers were also both great high school players at Walt, and then went on to play at Kentucky. I think that's something that you see a lot of guys, more so when you get to the pros than college, but it is something that can help. Patrick Mahomes, son of a former athlete. Steph Curry, son of a former athlete.
Yeah.
I think that stuff, especially just from how he's going to know how to handle and be in a big-time college football locker room, I think Blaylock's going to have an advantage over some of the other wide receivers in this class.
Mark Davis says it's nice to have at least one bigger wide receiver. And I think that Mark's right about that when you look at Alabama and what it was able to do to Georgia in the SEC championship game, we see Jalen Waddle having that great success. But a lot of that is predicated on the fact that you're worried about tall, fast receivers, blowing the top off your defense. That has softened up the middle. So Mark's right. That's one of the reasons why I like a collection of really good receivers. And Georgia's already got a collection of good receivers. I'm looking to add to that. But Mark's right. Jalen Waddle seems better at a place like Alabama than he would if he was playing at Arkansas because of the fact that you're worried about, the explosive, tall, deep threats, the ones that do go up and get it. All of a sudden, that does open up some more space for Waddle, which is the way that football is designed to work.
Right.
Let me go back over to YouTube for a moment, and we'll get a few of these and kind of get out of here. Antonio Jones says, I see Blaylock as a Danny Amendola type.
Oh, come on. Look, I love Danny Amendola. They had the Jaguars-Patriots game last year. It was huge for the Patriots. Dominic Blaylock's a hell of a lot better than Danny Amendola.
I think that in terms of the overall profile, you want to see him, fit at Georgia. Is you do want more of a matchup nightmare as opposed to that sort of what I think of as a kind of a plucky underdog type player.
And just because everyone they love to put Blaylock in the slide, so sort of just because he isn't that gigantic body guy. I think he is someone who, obviously he's going to need to get in the weight room and, just become more adept physically. But I think he is someone who, down the line, is someone who Georgia's going to feel comfortable putting outside and sort of winning matchups against those types of corners.
Here's the other thing. I know Art Brow's a little bit of a toxic name, but one of the cool things about Art Brow's when he was the head coach at Baylor is they put a guy in the slot and then still throw it deep to it. They throw deep out of the slot.
Now, that Baylor offense isn't – like, you talk about wanting – we talk about a lot about RBU and transferring to the NFL. That Baylor offense doesn't transfer at all to the NFL.
Right.
Just about all those offensive players wash out real quick.
I guess what I'm saying is I wouldn't mind seeing, and I agree with you, I think that Blaylock is eventually an outside receiver at Georgia, but I wouldn't mind seeing an athlete of Blaylock's caliber lined up in the inside, and then they throw deep to him like that. I just think that is kind of an interest. When you talk about, like, people say Georgia's offense needs to be more creative, that is an example of a level of creativity I'd love to see the Georgia offense take.
Yeah, just picking them apart on those seam routes. Just run a straight go right up the seam.
Yeah, can you imagine like a guy like Kyrus Jackson, who I do think is an inside receiver at Georgia? Imagine how much more effective some of those underneath routes with a strong guy like Jackson could be, a guy that does look a little bit like a running back. If he also occasionally makes you defend him all the way down the field, all of a sudden now you get the whole route tree in play. With a quarterback like Fromm, who I think of as being a pretty accurate guy, that's an example of a wrinkle that I'd love to see Georgia have, but it doesn't seem like you see much of that in the SEC at all.
No. Over on YouTube, Justin Dinkins brings up, I think, a really good comparison long-term for Dominic Blaylock, just based off what he's done in the NFL, but T.Y. Hilton was a guy a lot of people thought started off in the slot, used his speed and quickness to get open. Now Indianapolis, and Jake Fromm's a good quarterback. Like, he will be, I think, be able to get Blaylock the ball. Hilton, they put him on the outside. He's just a completely different animal and just a really tough cover both in the slot and on the outside. And I think that's, long term, I think that's where Blaylock sort of projects to do a lot of his damage both inside and as an outside one-on-one guy.
Yeah, really good. All right, we're going to get out of here in just a minute. Let me try to get a couple more comments in. D-Rob's a 4-3 guy. Listen, I'm going to end up doing this to myself again, and I'm going to be frustrated in the process, but I was all on the D-Rob train before the start of the season last year. Wrote about it, really into it. I'm gonna be there again come August. I can already kind of set my watch to that. I believe I'm gonna be back, writing about this again.
You're gonna be back on your corner,
making the case again. I'm gonna try to sort of temper expectations, but as the commenter just says, when you run that 4.3 speed, that's a weapon. That's a real weapon, and
it's going to be on James Coley to find a way to use him effectively next year. A lot of people have talked about, and I've been trying to get into this, but, doing a deep dive on the Coley offense, there's a lot of talk about him running a lot of screens at Miami. I think that's somewhere where Robertson could come in and show his just natural talent.
How about James Bryant? We don't see this a lot. He says that I'm liking YouTube too much. He says, while I'm over there, let's talk about him behind his back. I think I see a bald spot for me. Now, first of all, I've been very clear about this. That one of the things I have going for me is the fact that being 6'2", most people don't see, how bald I really am on the top of my head. Every now and then I will kind of, give you a little bit of a look-see on that. One of the things that does frustrate me from time to time is sometimes we do shows, we have like weird cameras, like a camera will kind of come from the side or something like that, and all of a sudden it's kind of getting me at a place where I'm vulnerable. So normally I try to stand up pretty tall, hold my shoulders back a little bit. That way you can't see. I look like Lake Lanier on the top of my head up here, man. It is bald and slick. So I got a decent amount going on right here. Not as much as I used to. It's turning a little gray in some cases. Up on the top though, man, it is not good. It is not a good situation. But it's nice to know that the YouTube people now feel like they're getting well taken care of anyway, as opposed to the typical charges of Facebook bias that I normally get. Nonetheless, I think
Facebook commerce they tend to stay a little bit more talking with us, whereas YouTube, they have their own conversations, and sometimes that does help expand our show when we're over there, and it helps us drive us to a new avenue.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Also one of the things that you see over time is that sometimes people show up as a part of the Facebook show for the first time, and they'll kind of gravitate towards YouTube over time. I don't really quite know why that is necessarily. We don't really care. However you enjoy the show is how we want you to enjoy it. But you do see a little bit of a migration there over time. And as Connor said, sometimes the two main comment sections can kind of
but we love unlike George Pickens and Dominic Blaylock, we love all our children equally here.
There you go. That's a good idea. All right, we got to get ready to go, and thanks for being with us here today. Hope you are getting ready for a great weekend. I think the weather's supposed to be kind of decent. I think maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'm wrong, but is it not supposed to be decent? Connor says it's not supposed to be decent at all. So, oh well. Stay indoors, I guess, then. Nonetheless, we'll be back here on Monday. Stay close to Dog Nation. News breaks will be all over that. Recruiting stuff, of course. Good luck to the basketball teams and the gym dogs and everything else kind of doing their show. Winfred Steinspring, thanks for the kind words. Chris Branham says when it comes to comment sections, Twitter, nobody talks to Twitter. The problem I have with the Twitter thing is it's a little bit hard to pull up the comment section. I guess I got to get better at that. I need to work on that. You got to realize, I'm essentially an Amish person. If it wasn't for young people like Connor, I don't even know how to be able to find my way into the studio every single day. So we'll see if we can get that figured out over the course of time here. But anyway, y'all have a great weekend. Back on Monday, 10 a.m., rolling towards a signing day and a whole lot of fun. We'll talk to you then.